From KCBS Radio in San Francisco, I'm Matt Pitman, and this is Bay Current for Thursday, January 27th. Major news out of Washington, D.C., with ties right here to the Bay Area, has the potential to upend Republican hopes of overtaking Congress in this year's midterm elections. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer will retire at the end of this year's Supreme Court calendar, one of only 3 liberal justices on a court packed with a supermajority of conservative judges. This paves the way for President Joe Biden to nominate a liberal judge to the nation's highest court. KCBS Radio politics reporter Doug Sovern joins me to talk about the biggest piece of news nationally, and that is the San Francisco product. 1955 graduate of Lowell High School, later went on to Stanford, before he went on to Oxford and then Harvard, and that is Justice Stephen Breyer stepping down, and that opens the way for Joe Biden to make his first nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. Did this one take you by surprise today that Breyer announced when he did?
Yeah, it did actually. And yes, he's an underachiever, right? Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. I mean, come on. Couldn't get in any good schools along the way. Anyway, I mean, it's... there's been a lot of pressure on him to do this, but he seemed to be resisting it. And I'd heard a rumor a while back that he would retire, and then it didn't happen. So I wasn't taking it that seriously this time either. But if you look at the calendar, it makes sense. And I think he finally succumbed to the pressure. I think, he's 83, but for all we know, he's in fine health, and he probably wanted to go a couple more years. But if you look at things, I mean, it's a 50-50 Senate with Kamala Harris breaking ties. So since they changed the rules, you only need 50 plus 1 now and not 60. Biden can get a successor confirmed with this Senate. But after November, all bets are off. The Republicans may well control the Senate. Mitch McConnell, we know how he feels about Democratic presidential appointees to the Supreme Court. He might not even take one up. I mean, if Breyer were to retire in 2023 or 4, McConnell might just sit on that seat until Trump or another Republican was in office again. So if Breyer was going to step down in the next, during Biden's first term, he really had to do it this year, or there might not be a confirmation because the Republicans would control the Senate. And after 2024, the Republicans may control the White House too. So really the only option for Breyer, if he wanted to ensure that his successor was also a Democratic appointee, was to go now. But I still, the signs to me were that he might resist that. But obviously the pressure became too much, or he's always been seen on the court as a bit of a pragmatist. So maybe he looked at this pragmatically too, even though, they're not supposed to think politically, right? But speaking, he's a political guy, and looking at that pragmatically, he may have thought it's now or never.
Now, Joe Biden was very clear, even in the presidential debates before he locked up the nomination, about what he wanted to do if he were elected president and he had the chance to nominate to the highest court in the land. And he said and stated unequivocally, he wants to be the first president to nominate for confirmation the first African-American woman to the United States Supreme Court. What do you imagine his list looks like right now?
Well, I think it's really short. There are 4 or 5 names that have been bandied about the last couple of years. And he's been unequivocal. Black woman for the Supreme Court. There's never been one. I mean, there have only been, 4 women? Sandra Day O'Connor, with 5 women, I guess now, with Amy Coney Barrett. There have been 5 women on the high court, 4 white and 1 Latina. And there's never been a black woman. And he wants to make history, just as Gavin Newsom did in California with his picks for the Senate with Alex Padilla and for the Secretary of State with Shirley Weber. He's been very clear about what he wanted to do, and Biden's been very clear about a black woman on the Supreme Court. And topping that list is a Californian, Leandra Kruger, who was put on the California Supreme Court by Governor Brown just a couple years ago. She's 45. She's extremely well educated too. Harvard, Yale Law, clerked at the U.S. Supreme Court. She worked in the Department of Justice under Obama, so she actually has argued before the Supreme Court a dozen times. By all accounts, a really smart, capable woman. She's also Jewish, so she's black and Jewish. And then you have Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is probably at the top of most people's lists. She is a D.C. Circuit judge in Washington, D.C., which has been the proving ground for justices in recent years. Amy Coney Barrett was on that court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on that court. It's sort of where they pluck Supreme Court justices from these days. And she also has impeccable credentials, Harvard Law, clerked for Breyer, which has to be a plus. There's been some recent tradition of that, having people replace justices for whom they clerked. So I think those two are probably at the top of the list. There are a couple others, but those are the two most prominent names. And it seems overwhelmingly likely that one of them is going to be President Biden's nominee.
So if you're Mitch McConnell right now, you probably don't regret changing the Senate rules, because that allowed you to get Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court, and then that paved the way for Brett Kavanaugh, and that paved the way for Amy Coney Barrett. The argument that a Kristen Sinema or a Joe Manchin makes is, well, if we change the rules now to get, Build Back Better, or if we get voting rights, if we change the rules now, that could come around to get us in the end, when power switches over. And that's going to probably happen to Republicans right now. But if you're Mitch McConnell, you got 3 judges on. So, that's part of the calculus, right? What, if any, mechanisms would Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans have right now to derail this? Do they have any? Not really much. I mean, as you say, they changed the rules. And looking at that, trade for Mitch McConnell, he'll take that any day of the week to get not just 3 justices on, but the balance of the court really shifted now, where it's 6-3 for Republican appointees, whereas replacing Breyer with any of the women I mentioned or someone else, it's still 6-3. This is not going to alter the ideological balance of the court. So it's less important for the Republicans to block this one, because they're not really losing much here. I mean, they're losing years in that you'll get somebody who will now be on the court in that seat for, 30 years or something. But it's not like suddenly it's going to make it 5-4. So they don't have to fight as hard on this. So yeah, he'll take that trade every day of the week. And as you say, changing the rules could come back to haunt whichever party does it. And that's one of the fears of the Democrats who oppose getting rid of the filibuster, that if they make it possible to pass these laws with 50+1, then who knows what laws the Republicans will pass when they're in control, which could be very soon. So I don't see a lot that the Republicans can do. I mean, you can filibuster all day long, but there isn't really much they can do. And Mitch McConnell doesn't control this calendar, so he can't do what he did when President Obama nominated Merrick Garland and say, well, we're not going to meet with him, and we're not going to consider this nominee, and I don't feel that it's appropriate. Well, we're not going to hear. I mean, he'll say those things again now, but they won't matter, because Chuck Schumer controls the confirmation process and the hearing schedule. And the Democrats have already said they're going to take a page right out of the Republicans' book with Amy Coney Barrett, and they're going to expedite this thing. Yeah. They're not going to take months and months and drag it out through the summer. They want to get a nominee and a confirmation before Breyer even leaves the seat, not only while the seat is still warm, while it's still hot. He'll be there to the end of June. They're talking about getting this done in the spring and having somebody already waiting in the wings, ready to take that seat the moment Stephen Breyer decides to walk out the doors. We talked last week here on the podcast, you and I, Doug, about the kind of perilous moment that Joe Biden finds himself in right now as his presidency turned 1 year old this month. His poll numbers are really, really bad. He has had some swings and misses on some legislation. Is this something that could maybe get a little bit of the mojo back for the Democrat Party and get their base a little bit more enthusiastic?
No question it could. If you're the Democrats, this is a godsend, because, first of all, it gives him an opportunity to bolster his credentials with the black community, which there's been a lot of disenchantment among progressives, among blacks, among a lot of the people who make up the Democratic Party base. They're not so thrilled about the job Joe Biden has done. And for him to get to put a black woman on the court, that is something he can point to directly in November and then beyond and say, look what I did for your community. And so I think that's really important. And it'll also galvanize the base in that it'll just even more, along with the Roe v. Wade, whatever abortion decision comes in June, whichever way that goes, whether it's gutted or overturned, it'll just raise the stakes for November and say, look, we've told you how important this is and that elections have consequences. We just put this person on the Supreme Court. The existing court just overturned or gutted Roe v. Wade. This is how important it is that the next Supreme Court appointee also come from a Joe Biden, or be someone that Biden can confirm with the Republican Senate. So yeah, there's no question that this nomination process and the abortion decision that comes in June combined are going to have a huge impact on the midterm elections. They do help the Democrats, I think, and they galvanize the base. On the flip side of that, the Republicans can use the counter argument, or really the same argument, and say, this is why this is so important to our side.
Oh, yeah.
Is that, look what the Democrats just did. We've got to keep Joe Biden from putting another person like that on the court. So they will both use it for fundraising and for voter mobilization, and it could have a huge impact in November.
And final question, Doug, what will be the legacy that Justice Breyer is leaving behind?
Well, I think he will be seen as, a real stalwart member of the liberal wing, someone with a very strong record for abortion rights, for gay rights, LGBTQ rights. He, as I said, he's regarded as a pragmatist, not a guy who necessarily seeks compromise, but somebody who looks at the real world impact of their decisions and, not in some ivory tower and, with an abstract approach to, well, we're going to follow the law and this is what it says and, consequences be damned. He looks at the impact of decisions. And I think you see that in his opinions time and time again. And, this is not what the framers intended. They didn't want this impact. And we're not going that direction. And he's had a real impact on some of the abortion rights cases. So I think he will go down in history for that. And as someone, that seat for many years, think about whom he succeeded, Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe v. Wade.
Right.
I mean, that legacy was very important to Breyer. Some really landmark social justices have been in that seat. And I think Breyer has proven himself a worthy successor to it. If I can add one more thing, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, go for it.
I just want to add one personal note about Justice Breyer retiring. This seat has always had sort of a special significance in my family because, and I very few people know this, but when Bill Clinton appointed Stephen Breyer, almost 28 years ago, he had a short list of 2, which was, he cut the list way down to 2, and the other name on that list was never publicly disclosed. They kept it very secret. There were some meetings at the White House, and that second person, the runner-up for this seat, was my father. And he was going to be the nominee if it wasn't going to be Breyer. And they went with Breyer in part because he was 7 years or so younger, and they wanted somebody who could serve longer. And so my dad came away disappointed, but an enthusiastic supporter of Breyer, as he had been of the previous appointee, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a very close friend of his. So I've always thought about, and he had thought about, how his life would have been very different if he had spent the last quarter century on the Supreme Court instead of doing what he was doing instead. And sadly, my dad passed away 2 years ago last week. So had he filled that seat, it would have been replaced by Donald Trump, not by Joe Biden. So history could have been very different. And these are the twists and turns fate takes and history takes. And it brings us here to this point where now Joe Biden gets to replace this Supreme Court justice.
That is incredible. And you're right. I never knew this. You and I have never even discussed this before. That's remarkable. What do you remember about that process? As you mentioned, obviously very secretive, and I imagine that's pretty standard for folks that are on a short list. What do you remember about that process going all the way back to, 1994?
Yeah, it would have been 94. Not much because, let's see, I was already living in California, and my dad kept it very close to the vest. He had already been involved in Ginsburg's nomination. And went to the White House thinking he had been summoned to discuss the next appointee and give advice on who that should be, and met with Lloyd Cutler, who was the White House counsel, and with President Clinton, and was flabbergasted, in fact, when he was told, no, we're here to talk about you as the nominee.
Wow.
I mean, he had no idea, and they kept it very, very hush-hush, but they did the whole, FBI background check and all the stuff they do. And in the end, my dad was 62 and Breyer, I think, was 55. Mm-hmm. And they had recently changed the guidelines that you shouldn't appoint anyone over 60. So that was a big factor. You wanted someone who could serve a long time. We were told very little about it at the time. He obviously would have taken the job if it had been offered. There had been previous opportunities in Washington that he did not take, and that the family, we all didn't think he should take. But something like that, you just don't say no to.
Oh my goodness, no, that's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. That is outstanding. Sure. That's incredible.
Thank you.
Doug, I mean, I say it every time I have you on, always very insightful, and this is why. I mean, just a really cool anecdote to the biggest story on national politics, certainly this week. Doug Sovern is our political reporter at KCBS Radio, host of the State of California every afternoon on KCBS Radio at 3:30. That's where you can catch him, and also on the State of California podcast. Doug, appreciate it as always.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks again to my colleague Doug Sovern, and thank you for listening. New episodes of Bay Current are out every day, and we'd love to be part of your daily routine. You can subscribe to the podcast on the Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, just about anywhere you listen. And every episode is on the KCBS Radio YouTube page, and there's a link to that in our show notes. That's it for today's Bay Current. I'm Matt Pitman, and we'll chat with you again tomorrow.